Hello and welcome to this 261 Fearless Empowerment Talk. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Edith Sushman, CEO and co-founder of 261 Fearless, and I'm your host today. We at 261 Fearless, we use running to unite and empower women globally through running. And we are very passionate about improving the health and well-being of women from all backgrounds and cultures. So we are very strong looking to help women to get together, but also educate themselves. And that's the reason why we feature this 261 Empowerment Talks to present high-profile, influential women in business, sports, health, and leadership roles. So we want to learn from them. We want to be inspired, motivated, and also get wonderful information how we can improve our well-being and our empowerment. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, we are not able to meet our today's guest in person, but I'm very pleased to use modern technology to talk to her. Please welcome with me Ghita El Khyari. Thank you for being with me today. She is a very, very fearless woman who dedicated her life and her work to women who live in crisis-affected regions. So lovely having you with us today, Ghita.
Thanks, Edith, and thanks for having me.
So, Ghita, please, can you introduce yourself a little bit? Where are you originally from?
So I'm from Morocco. I'm from Rabat, which is the capital of the country.
And what are your major career steps?
I started my career working with the local government at the Regional Council of Île-de-France, which is the region of Paris, France, working on international affairs in the council. Then I moved to Morocco, where I was a diplomat for 3 to 4 years. So I served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Morocco for a few years. And after that, I joined the UN back in 2012.
Wow, what a career. Very fearless. And where do you live at the moment?
Well, it's complicated. My job is in New York, so that's where my job is. But at the moment, I'm in France, where I'm based for now.
So you have been in quarantine for how many weeks?
So I've been working from home now it's my 7th week.
And how have you kept yourself fit during this time?
Oh, well, I tried so many things. I think as everybody else, I've been walking a lot. So here we need a form to get out for a walk, but we're allowed to up to 1 hour per day close to your home. You're not allowed to go over 1 kilometer away from where you live. So that's one. So I've been using that up to 1 hour walking around my house. I've been trying a lot of online courses as well. Fitness, yoga, you name it. I've tried a lot of apps that provide, coaching online for people who are at home.
Oh, actually, you told me you're a very active person. So what have you been doing in your earlier life or still doing in terms of being active?
Well, when I was younger, I was doing a lot of things, but the main thing that I was into was football or soccer, as they call it in the US. And then I had to stop because of a knee injury, but this was really a passion of mine. But I tried a lot of different things. Basketball. I'm super tall. You cannot see that, but I'm very tall. Basketball, volleyball, ping pong. Tennis table tennis, and yeah, a lot of different things.
Oh, awesome! And who was your inspiration, your mentor, not only for your business life, but also perhaps towards sports?
Well, I'm not from a very sportive family, so I guess that was just a way for me to kind of be with other people. So I always was very much into like collective or group sports. So I'm not sure who motivated me. I think it was just a way for me to be with other kids and all the children. As for my motivation for my career, I guess it's not very different or original, but my parents probably. My dad used to be a activist, and my mom is also a women's rights activist back in Morocco. So yeah, that's where the inspiration comes from.
Oh wow, wonderful. So, about inspiration, you are the head of Secretariat of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. So please, can you give us a little introduction of this amazing organization, and also give us some insights how you got to into this role? Yeah, please share it with us.
Yeah, sure. So the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, it's the United Nations Fund that supports women's organizations in conflict settings and in crisis settings. That means that we think, and we don't just think, it's based on evidence and research and studies, that when women participate in conflict resolution, in mediation, in humanitarian response, etc., it makes peace more effective and more sustainable because it's more representative of all the population. And there's actually evidence that peace is more sustainable when women and girls are engaged, and that they meaningfully participate in the peace negotiations, in the mediation process, in the peace building, etc. And it's the same for humanitarian response. If we don't engage women as decision maker in how the humanitarian response is designed, then obviously the specific needs of women and girls, because women and girls have specific needs and specific concerns, they won't be addressed. And the humanitarian response and the delivery of the aid is not going to be as effective without the women, obviously, than with the women. So basically, the principle is simple. Women's participation is a right. So women have the right to participate to all of these processes to build peace and respond to crisis. But women's participation is also a value for everyone, that everyone benefits from women participating. So based on that, we support civil society organizations, non-profits, non-governmental organizations such as yourself, around the world who prevent crisis and respond to conflict. And we have been supporting over 130 organizations so far, and we're continuing to grow. Back in 2016, I was already working for the United Nations, but I was working in the Maghreb region, covering Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And I was asked by our headquarters, which is in New York, to come to help on the establishment of this fund, because it's a pretty recent fund. It was only launched in 2016. And then I stayed. So I went there to kind of help the setup, the launch. I was not the head of the fund at the time, but then after some time, after a few months, I was asked to stay and to kind of take the lead on the fund.
Wow! And what was the main point for you to make the decision? I'm going to take this offer.
Well, I don't think it was a no-brainer. I don't think I even hesitated. No, it was great because it was such a challenge. Something new that you need to grow and exist and happen and survive, but also a huge challenge to be kind of responsible for this great initiative. I also really like the fact that this is something that is for and with civil society organizations, and that we also have decision-making processes within the fund that also involve them, so that they're not only beneficiaries or targets of the funding, but also decision makers with the United Nations and with the member states, and where the money is spent, how, within what time frame, etc., etc.
So you choose for taking over responsibility.
Yes.
And actually, talking about responsibility or responsibilities towards women, what drives you to support women? What is your driver to work for a women's organization?
Well, look at me. I'm a woman, obviously, but also I'm a woman born in a country where there are a lot of challenges. I've been raised as a feminist. I know some people think it's a bad word, but I just consider it being for gender equality and equality in between men and women. That's all what it means. And in Europe, this is something that is not the case anymore. But coming from a country like Morocco, I was born with injustice around me. Let's put it this way. So, of course, there's a lot of progress made in Morocco. My mom is a women's rights activist, has been fighting her whole life for women's rights. But when you're born in such a context, and after some time you're told that you're not able to inherit the same as your brother. I don't have a brother, but if you don't have a brother, you cannot inherit the full inheritance from your parents, or you don't have the same rights as men. It's just, especially when in your family the values are different, the injustice is very hard to kind of understand and accept. So that's really the one of the strongest drivers for me, is that I have been confronted with gender inequality and gender injustice since I was a little girl. So for me, it's just a natural kind of space where to engage.
Oh, wow. So this leads me to a very sensitive question, because you mentioned Europe, where you see equality has become something usual at some points. In some other areas and countries, it's definitely not the case. So where do you see the most differences when it comes to gender equality between continents, or where is the most need to develop on this topic?
So I honestly think that we all have issues, and nobody has solved all their issues with regard to gender equality. But I think one of the main kind of differences is discrimination in the law. Because, for example, in Europe, we don't have any gender discrimination in the law. So there are no rights that you don't have and that men have, like on paper. But then in practice, it's a different story, right? And so even in Europe, or even in Scandinavia, which are always very often cited as very as examples or models in the field of gender equality, in practice there are still a lot of issues to be addressed. But I guess when the first step is really to kind of remove all of the discriminations in the law, because that's where you can base then your action to make equality not just a concept, but also a reality for women and men. In Europe, for example, in salary, there's a pay gap between men and women. There's still the violence, the harassment, the discrimination at work. Things like that obviously are not in the law, but are still in the practices, in the mentalities of people. So we cannot say that there is one country or one continent that has made it yet, unfortunately.
And you said, like in Europe or in the United States, we already have it on paper in the law. So what would be the path, or what kind of path is, or what are the biggest resources to really get it into the society? Are these the women, or to execute and protest to get those laws into reality? Or what would you call the recipe to execute?
Well, I think there is something about also making women more conscious and more active about the fact that the battle is not won, and the fight is still worth to be fought. So I think one is women's engagement, to kind of push things a little bit further in terms of the implementation or the effectiveness, what we call, of the agenda. But also, it's not women's responsibility. It's the government's responsibility to make sure that they have. This is super boring, but that they have like indicators and ways to like follow and to actually measure what happens then, in the reality. Because if you don't have the data, if you don't know what happens in your country, how would you address it, right? So, for example, you would say anybody can access to a board of a company, right? Anybody, a man, a woman, anybody can access. But then when you look at it in reality, then you find out that in some countries you have 5% of women in the boards of big companies, right? The law doesn't say that, obviously, but there are still barriers within the company that makes it impossible for women to make it to the top. Impossible, because when you're pregnant, or if you're a young woman and you have pregnancy plans, you're going to be discriminated against because of a lot of reasons. So what we call affirmative action, which is quotas, very voluntary measures by the governments, are also very helpful. And finally, we need to also engage men, because ultimately men and boys are also part of this, and they also benefit from gender equality. The same way as there are gender-based stereotypes on women at home, women cooking, women with the domestic burden, etc. There are also gender-based stereotypes towards men. Men cannot cry, men cannot weak, men have to provide for the family, and those are also very heavy stereotypes to be carried by men as well. So I think it's also liberating a little bit for men and boys to kind of, and it's also a value for them to engage in this fight.
Yeah, and when we take women, how can women support each other? Because when we have 5% in the leadership roles, how can those 5% help to lift up other women to get into these positions? What would you recommend, especially those women?
I think so. The first thing is that we need to have at least something like 30% of women, so that then it becomes a little bit. It changes the dynamics. It changes the environment. It makes the environment more friendly, more open to women. So that's the kind of overarching framework. But then in terms of how individually the women can support women, I think mentoring kind of models, networking models are super helpful. Men network all the time. Strong women need to support women. That's how I see it. Although we cannot consider that women again represent all of the other women out there. It's a little bit more nuanced than that.
I would now like to shift towards the topic of your profession, your responsibility, talking about women in crisis. When we look at crisis, how do crises in general affect women? What are the 3 or 4 main things that affecting women?
Well, crisis hit everybody, but crisis hit parts of the populations that are more fragile and the weakest in terms of rights and in terms of establishment in the society, not like physically fragile or weak, the hardest. So women, for example, so there are things that are specific to women as women, and there are things where women are victims or targeted by the crisis more because they're in more fragile situations. So in terms of the first one, which is how wars and conflicts and humanitarian crisis hit women harder, well, there is the sexual and gender-based violence has been used for years, since the beginning of humanity actually, as a tactic of war. So this is how you retaliate against your opponents. How do? You go and rape their women. So that has been like a tactic of war that has been used for centuries since war has started. So this is really like one weapon specifically targeted at women and girls, raping women and girls during conflict, and that's something that's really heartbreaking, to be honest. That women and girls keep to be targeted in such a way to kind of retaliate against a community, because that's where the honor of the community resides, and so you're gonna go and rape their women as a retaliation measure. So that's a part of also my job, is how to prevent that from happening, and also how, when it happens, to provide support to the survivors, women and girls who have survived these assaults. So that's obviously the most kind of striking things that happen to women as women because they are women during a war. And then there are other, obviously, effects. Women also, for example, have specific needs, such as reproductive and sexual health needs and rights. That when you are in a conflict, usually all of the services are kind of stopped and paused, right? Because there's a conflict, the government is failing to respond to the citizens and to provide the services and healthcare services, including pre and post natal healthcare, are really threatened during that period. Then obviously, it has an economic impact on women and girls. Women and girls are overrepresenting within the refugee populations, because women go at war and then their wives and children are left alone. So you see a lot of women head of households within the refugee communities where they have never worked and they're not used to gain a livelihood. So there are really a lot of dimensions. But I just want to say that the way we see it is that women are not just victims. And actually, it has been the paradigm for quite some time. When you talk about war and conflict and women, it's always, oh, women are victims. Women are, they're, in a difficult situation. But that's not the entire story. So the story is also about women responding, finding solutions, mediating conflicts, providing response, humanitarian aid, rebuilding their communities after the war. And that's also the part of the story that we want to promote.
Well, this links me to a quote I found from one of your speeches, where you said, from supporting the economic empowerment of Syrian women refugees to engaging Colombian women in peace implementation, we are proving that financial investment in local women produces global dividends to transformative change, which is really a wonderful quote. And so seeing it more from a positive aspect, and especially the financial investment into women in those conflict areas. So please, can you talk a little about these main aims and these activities around helping women through funding?
Yeah, I think this helping women is the most untapped resource. This is the thing that we haven't tried. Really, we have tried so many other things to solve conflict and achieve world peace. We haven't really tried investing in women. With OECD, every year looks at, not every year, but every couple of years, they look at how much money goes to countries in conflict and in crisis, and how much goes to women's organizations, and that's 0.2%. So in terms of aid, and that's not okay. Especially that we, as I was telling you earlier, we have the evidence that it works. Why? Again, I just want to go back a little bit to that. One, because we need to support local actors. I think it's super important to empower local actors. They know better than anybody. They know better than me what is good for their community. I'm not going to go and tell them what to do. They have the knowledge of the context much better than anybody else. They know, they have the reach to their communities. They have already thought about solutions. So all what we do is that we listen to that and we look at what they put on the table, and then we just support them. With money, with capacity, and with also, which is super important, linking them to one another. So we are a global fund. For me, it's super important that we, for example, a woman in Colombia who's working on the implementation of the peace agreement, and then another woman working in, I don't know, Burundi or in another context, and how can we help them connect and talk to one another to make sure that they benefit from their experiences. But so yes, we have been supporting women around the world during this type of work because, again, so I was saying it's important to support local organizations, but it's also important to support women's organizations, because women have a specific view on how to address the specific needs of women and girls, but also because, as I was saying, when women participate in conflict resolution, in conflict mediation, then that the peace that we achieve through that is more sustainable, and it's more far-reaching than if they're not involved. And just to give you an example, in Burundi, we're supporting a network of women mediators, and it's a network that has over 500 members. They are in all the provinces of Burundi, and they go and solve the conflicts in the community. So, for example, across 2 years, they have estimated 25,000 the number of conflicts that they have addressed. They can even tell you what's their success rate. So their success rate is still 65% of like their ability to solve the conflict. And then on top of that, what they do is that they do community dialogues. So everybody sit down, at the village level, and they discuss the issues. They have reached out to 1.3 million people through these community dialogues. So it just shows you at the level or the scale of a country of like Burundi, which is 11 million, they are able to reach out to 10% of the population with an investment that we give them of $2 million, which is peanuts at the level of what the global international community spends in these crisis settings. So we also try to show that the value of supporting women and the global dividends in terms of peace and security that it brings. So it's not just good for women, it's good for everybody, and it's good for the world and for the peace in general.
That's wonderful to get a better insight on that, because we often only read the headlines, but digging into it and get a better understanding what it means. It can also be translated not only into these areas, I think in every community, where everywhere you have about 50-50. And if we sit together and exchange and try to find solutions together, hopefully it's more sustainable. Actually, talking about crisis, currently we are facing one of the biggest crises in the last century, the COVID-19. Every country is affected, and it's definitely clear that also women are very much affected on it. What kind of advice would you give to women, no matter where they are at the moment, to go well through this crisis, or to manage it well?
At the personal level, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's hard. Stay at home and try to help others. I guess that's the two main things. We can all stay at home and at the same time try to help in a small way somebody around you. It can be just a phone call to people who are alone. It can be in your community. And I think that's probably one of the greatest value of us going through this crisis would be to kind of strengthen the solidarity links between people.
Actually, as 261 Fearless is about getting women active and help them through physical activity to overcome their fears. When you work with women in crisis and or organizations who support women in affected areas, out of your experience, how does physical activity support women in crisis?
So I think there are two maybe kind of links here with what we do. So obviously, I'm sure physical activity has, that's just my personal opinion and not really based on my work, but I think it has, in terms of mental well-being and kind of fighting anxiety and in very stressful environments and situations, I'm sure that's a huge value. And fortunately, in a lot of the communities where I work, there is no I think there is still need for more awareness on that, and also the kind of take care of yourself, the self-care kind of paradigm is not very well understood in the sense of you need to take care of your children and your community and your family and your parents and all of that before you take care of yourself. That's not the priority. So I think there's a lot of work to do on that, and how taking care of yourself through activity or physical activity is not seen as something selfish, which might seem a little bit weird, but that's even in countries like Morocco, not anymore, but in certain contexts, that's how it's like seen, so that it's okay to prioritize yourself a little bit sometimes and to give it an hour a day, or 30 minutes a day, or whatever you can do to just feel better. So that's the first thing that I want to say. I just want to say that also there is a stronger link, I think, between sports and gender equality, but you know this better than I do. And, for example, we support a project in the DRC where women are building a soccer field. I love this project. And it's like somewhere in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and they're building this soccer field as a way to kind of bring the communities together as well. Which brings me to my other point, which is how sports in general, and activity, especially collective activity, is really also, I think, a tool for peace, because it just teaches you how to be in healthy competition and not fight each other. It just puts structures and boundaries on how to kind of organize your competition around rules and things like fair play but yeah, I love that project about the soccer field in the DRC. I think it's great because again it kind of addresses several issues at the same time: gender equality, gender stereotypes, peace, bringing the communities together around like a same kind of game. That's a game.
Mm. Well, so still a lot to do on this end. And yeah, I hope 261 can make at least a little bit of an impact in this field. But all those projects are sometimes related to funding. So I want to dig also into this. You are working in the field of funding. When it comes to financial support of women's projects, what is most important for you to make those funded projects sustainable?
Well, so once we select a project and then we start funding the project, we don't give only funding. We're trying to also build the capacities of the civil society organizations. We are currently developing a program developing a new program of capacity building, where we try to help them get better at, not at what they do, which they're great at, but rather on how to manage their organization, and how to manage the organization financially, how to organize themselves, how to raise additional funding it's from maybe other sources, etc. So that's one. The second thing that we try to do as well to make the project sustainable is that we try to, so at the country level, we have what we call national steering committees. So we try to involve other stakeholders at the country level, the government, the local governments, but also other donors around the table, so that there is continued support. And maybe even the government in some cases is going to say, oh, has worked very well. Let's scale it up. Let's use that model and scale it up to other regions or other provinces, etc. So that's how we try to help them sustain the projects. Obviously, we also link them also to one another. As I was saying, we have this global platform that we have developed with Dell Technology, who's been doing this pro bono project for us, where they have been developing a community of practice where women can talk to each other virtually, obviously, to continue the conversation and learn from one another.
Cool, wonderful. And is there a specific project you could point out where it started very small and then really got to the governmental scale and beyond?
So that's the Burundi project that I just mentioned is typically really an example of that. So it started very small in one province, and now it's nationwide network of women mediators supported by the local governments. Obviously, the local governments also see really a value because it diffuses the conflicts, and it prevents them. When people talk about conflict, they think that all of a sudden there's just like two parties and they start shooting at themselves. This is not how a conflict starts. the conflicts usually, especially the conflicts that have like an ethnic dimension or like a, like a kind of civil dimension, what happens is that it's at the community level that conflict starts to escalate, and then the rumors, the fake news, the hearsay, etc., that actually then escalates into like larger, and then it happens to blow, as a national conflict. So obviously, the local governments also see that as having value for them to kind of prevent that from happening.
Mm. Yeah. Financial resources are always a barrier or limiting the support. Let's go to the individual level and get away from money. What can each of us, each woman can do to support other cultures, countries, women on other continents or crisis-affected areas, just with, non-financial resources? Could you give us a few ideas for that, how we can help?
Well, I think time is something that's also super helpful and very important. Giving some of your free time. I think we live in such a global world that you don't need to go very far away to help people from other cultures, right? And we were discussing this before we started this interview. But I think, we all have communities wherever we live, of women who are exactly the same as the ones that I'm working with, but they're not based in, Uganda or Rwanda, but they're based in Belgium or in the US or in Austria, or, the immigrants communities, the refugee or asylum seekers communities. These are the same people as the one that I work with. But I would work with Syrian refugees in Jordan, or with internally displaced women and girls, Yazidi in Iraq, who are in internally displaced camps or informal settlements, etc. But these are the same people who are also getting to other parts of the world. And it doesn't have to be Europe. There are a lot of refugee populations in most African countries, or some Asian countries. So I think there's still always some ways to help and volunteer through language classes, through support to children in terms of schooling, etc. I think that's probably the easiest and most efficient way.
True. Yeah, and then the circle closes, because we can go to those organizations supporting those women and spend our time, and then we can grow together.
Yes, exactly.
To round up our talk, which I'm very much enjoying with you, I would like to ask you for your 3 main key learnings out from your job.
Oh, wow. There are so many learnings from my job, and I guess so many things that I would have done differently. I think doubt is key. Everything that we do, no, that's true. I think it's really important to doubt, everything that you do, because it just helps you kind of get better and do things better. Well, the key learnings, let me think a little bit. I think the first one would be how, we did a global women's forum for peace and humanitarian affairs in Vienna in February this year, and I wish I had done that before. So that's the first time we bring together in person right before the COVID-19 kind of blew up. So it was really perfect timing, because I think if we have waited for a couple of weeks, it wouldn't have never happened. But I think it was the first time that we took the time to kind of bring all of our partners, not all of them, but most of the active ones, the ones that have active projects with us, into the same room. And until then, I was considering that it might be a waste of money to do that. But actually, it it was not. It was really one of the greatest professional experiences I've ever had, to be able to see the people that you're supporting, not only to see them in front of you. I remember this person from the north of Mali, from the desert, the nomadic populations, with a small they had prepared a small gift for us that said Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. And it was anyway, I got super emotional, but not only that, because it's a bit shallow, but to enable them to speak to one another and to meet one another. We keep saying these things and they kind of seem empty at some point, but actually it really brings value. And it was great. And in 2 days they have discussed and adopted a declaration, Vienna Declaration, that has asked the governments and the international community for certain things. So what their needs are for the future. And I think it was really, really of great value for them and for everybody kept asking when are we doing this next. But I think also when you start an online conversation, it's always good to start it first in person and then you can continue it online. It just kind of starts it builds the links and the relationship, and then it's much easier to bring that online. The other thing that I learned, and we have tried to apply this for the COVID-19 response that we're providing now, we need to also accept to give funding to NGOs for their institutional support, right? Because the problem that we have is that we tend to ask always organizations to do projects and activities to get funding, but it's not super sustainable. And sometimes they would just do activities just so that they can pay for the salaries and the rent. So it kind of brings things under kind of wrong perspective. So for this COVID-19 emergency response window, for example, we decided that we would dedicate part of the funding to just help them, because they're not able to do any activity anyway if they don't do COVID-19 response. So we're just going to help them to survive through this crisis and help them, to pay for the rent, the salaries, and also the technology that they will need, the hand sanitizers, the masks, everything that that is not necessarily activity related to be funded. And then the third one, I think, would be more connection from the local to the global. I've been trying to do a lot of bringing women peace builders and responders to International Security Council, United Nations Peace Building, Architecture Review, and all of that as briefers. And this is something that we're trying to do more and more, so that the policy the decisions can be informed by women who are doing the work at the really community level.
So getting them together.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And when you would turn the time ahead, so let's say 10, 20 years, where would you like to see our society? What's your dream?
Well, how do I not make this cheesy? That's my challenge. I work on gender equality and peace, so it's hard to avoid the cheesiness of the response. Well, I would say a little bit less investments in military spending to be, not to say world peace, which is not realistic. Let's just say better priorities in terms of government spending. So a little bit less investment in military spending, and a little bit more in conflict prevention, pandemic preparation, public services, things like that. I think this crisis has also shown how crazily important the investments in the military has been compared to what has gone to healthcare services. It's just really crazy in terms of when you put both in perspective. And what is needed right now, which is not the military spending, but rather the public services. So that would be one, a little bit more balance between the military spending and also investment in preventing conflict. because the problem is that when we intervene into conflict, it's already too late. Nobody's really working seriously on preventing the conflict from happening, which would be not only better in terms of life saving, etc., but also in terms of if you only think about it in financial perspectives, it's much more worth it than investing after the thing happened, right? So a little bit more balance in that. And what I would like to see is the discrimination against women in the law disappear totally from any country in the world. At least that. I'm trying to be realistic and reasonable.
And then we move on locally, that it's going to happen. Yeah, that's a 3 wonderful goals for the next 20 years. But actually, to close this, I could go on and on with you. Thank you so much. And I also thank you, our audience, for watching our 261 Empowerment Talk. I hope you enjoyed it the same way like I did. So be ready for the next one, and also be ready for the next decade, century, where we want to support women to be more empowered and to make this world a better place. So thank you, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.